So here is our first chapter of 3 for this week for Windows. This is a pretty easy chapter. These 3 chapters are pretty easy. There's nothing too heavy. If you've never ever seen Windows in your life, then maybe this will be earth-shattering. But for most of us, it's stuff you've seen before. So Windows comes in many different flavors. And not many, not like Linux. But you have, 6 versions up here? 6, 7 different versions. One thing that they do share in common is they all have the same core. So whatever affects one version of Windows affects all of the different versions of Windows, including server. They are all made from the same core. So they all share the same vulnerabilities, the same issues. So if you see something that's affecting a Windows 10 version, then it affects them all. The difference between them all is what they can do, their features. So Home is the one that has the least amount of features, whereas Enterprise and Ultimate have the most. So here's some basic things of what Home has. Professional has more things, like it can support up to 2 terabytes of RAM. It does Hyper-V, whereas Home didn't. It can join a domain, whereas the Home cannot. The Enterprise has the same things as Professional, along with these items like Direct Access, App Locker, Branch Cache, and so forth. Education is basically Enterprise without the long-term service branch feature, and it has licensing that's different from Enterprise. Mobile, which we haven't quite seen a lot anymore, but that's a version. And M and K are 2 specific versions that are, one is sold in countries where they can't use Windows Media Player, which is no longer around, by the way. And the K, which is only sold in South Korea. So since Windows 10 came out, it has a number of features. So now some of these we've already seen around and they're not necessarily new. So for example, Windows 10 is still able to run as 32-bit, even though everybody's getting away from that. Everybody is going 64-bit only, which can hold more RAM, which can process more data. A passport is still a feature that exists in the Microsoft realm. It's their version of a multi-factor authentication. So adding things like pins or connecting it with Active Directory, that kind of stuff. The Windows Store, which familiar with for either good reasons or bad. That's been around since for Windows 10. Microsoft Edge, which is dying. And here's my first link for you. If you didn't already hear in the news, it is going to die. Really leaving only 3 browsers around, leaving Chrome with its Chromium base, Safari with its WebKit, and Firefox. I don't remember what their core is, but it's really down to 3 browsers now. Cortana, the wannabe Siri and Google Assistant. Windows Update, which you are not able to turn off. Oh, and here's a link on if you want to uninstall Cortana. Opera is based in Chromium, so I do not see it as a separate browser. When it comes to updating, you should always install any of the updates that are important or critical. You should know which updates are, because it has happened and it continues to happen when updates don't quite do their job and instead mess things up. And the last thing you want is to install updates that will destroy your system or your infrastructure and have to spend time rolling back. The one of the links that I put in is for the Internet Storm Center. They do a great job of posting a chart with what updates should you install. Like, this is critical, so you probably should get this installed. Some that are less important, you can pick and choose, so on and so forth. You want to have a good resource to find out what updates need to be installed and which ones can wait, installing all the criticals right away. There's the easy upgrade, which will help you upgrade from something like Windows 10 Home to Professional or Enterprise, updating the license. There's Continuum, which is basically their touch screen, the touchscreen function. That's called Continuum. It's used in a Surface if you have it. And then here's the list of common items that you see all the time when you're on a Windows desktop: the lock screen, the start menu, the search interface, the taskbar. Again, these are things that if you've ever worked with Windows for a while, you know where they are and what they do. Oh, that's a horrible lock screen. The start, oh, these pictures messed up. Let's see, do I have the... Yes, I do. So let's scroll. This is slide 22. Scroll down to slide 22. Aha, much better. So let's share screen. There we go. Oh, might have messed it up. Much better. There's your lock screen. If you didn't know what that's called, that's exactly what it's called, is the lock screen. The start menu, which we have seen since Windows 95 and keeps changing in every iteration of Windows. The search interface, which used to be run and now has become search. Our taskbar, where we have all our buttons to represent shortcuts or any previews that we want. The notification area on the bottom right that has the action center and all kinds of stuff that all the programs are running in the background. And then some features of Windows, of the UI, of like when it snaps, you can snap a window to be resized automatically. You can shake it or see the task view. There's your taskbar. If you didn't know what it's called the taskbar. Windows 10 does have some hardware requirements. It can't necessarily run on anything and everything. So you need at least 32 or 64-bit, 1 gigahertz or faster, 1 gig of RAM, 16 gigs of disk space, and a video card. While it does do system on a chip like a Raspberry Pi, it's not necessarily the strongest system running on a Pi. For most processors, especially modern CPUs, they all have things like multitasking and can run multiple threads at once. This is what allows our games to run as fast as possible. Some things that are tied with Windows specifically is like what is considered quantum, and you see this in like the task manager, the time window a thread is allowed to run, how the thread is restricted to which CPU. It is possible to say Microsoft Word will only run on CPU 0, whereas Firefox can work on cores 2 and 3. most, if not all, Windows programs use dynamic link libraries, which is important to secure because it is possible to inject code into these libraries and have multiple programs run insecure code. It used to be that processors were only one, and now we have hyperthreading and multiprocessing, which Windows can take advantage of as a modern operating system. So it supports multiple processors if you have more than one processor on the system, like a server, and multi-cores, which we're used to on our end machines. They also support plug and play. This is what allows you to plug in a USB drive without having to turn off the whole system and turn it back on again. It has power management features, which again, a lot of this stuff just sounds like, yeah, I know it existed, but it didn't quite exist. It's taken some iterations to get all this stuff refined and appear in OSs. Tablet, mostly the Surface, but it is possible to run Windows 10 on a tablet. Like I said, Windows Media Center has died. It's been replaced by something else. I don't actually know off the top of my head, mostly because I don't run Windows. I run Linux on my systems. Windows 10 can handle SATA, SCSI, or USB. And let me know if you find a modern machine with SCSI. iSCSI does not count. But it also supports virtual hard disks. And of course, it supports the Microsoft, the Microsoft, not VMDK, VHD. SAS is serial attached SCSI. No, I mean SCSI. The one that had the huge plug. Disks, when it comes to disks, we have, it has to have a firmware that works with it. So you can't necessarily use an old school drive. It has to be somewhat modern to work with this OS. We have our BIOS, which is now referred to as the old school, if you say a BIOS, versus UEFI, which is the newer alternative. Windows supports FAT32 and NTFS. NTFS has been around for a gajillion years and hasn't been updated, yet Windows still supports it. exFAT, it was supposed to replace FAT32, but it hasn't really taken off as much. The NT file system. When it came out, it was a good idea because it had things like secure storage. It could do things like file encryption. The thing with it is it hasn't changed since it got updated. So a lot of tools can break NTFS. One of the biggest problems of Windows 10 is it works with legacy applications. So as an attacker, finding a way to downgrade to run something old that doesn't have all the securities that exist currently makes Windows 10 vulnerable. You can run an application as far back as 95. This is useful for some places. I used to help out a company who did custom headlights for motorcycles, and they actually use DOS in order to send the schematic to the machine to mill it. The compatibility troubleshooter. Anybody actually use this thing with success? All right. It's a good idea, but not as successful as it should be. Client Hyper-V. Truth be told, in the industry, you're going to see more Hyper-V than VMware, especially in small shops, because Hyper-V comes with Windows, whereas VMware, you have to pay like $3,000 for a license. So I would suggest learning how to use Hyper-V, and that is a portion of this course, is covering Hyper-V. Then there's some ways to connect with Windows. Please do not use remote desktop. That is vulnerable. There are tools that are looking for any system that has RDP open to the web and actively exploiting. Please do not use RDP. And if you have to use RDP, at least use a VPN. Please do not use RDP. Or use another tool that encrypts your traffic. Same with remote assistance. Both of these were not built with security in mind. This password can be cracked. So please don't trust that just because it says it has generated a password is secure. Home groups have been around since Windows 7, so that a small group of computers can share stuff kind of like a peer-to-peer and a mix of the domain controller without having a domain controller. Semi-useful, but if you're sharing stuff amongst each other, I mean, it's easier to have control using a domain. And speaking of, if you have a Windows machine and it is not joined to a domain, it is by default part of a workgroup called workgroup. And let me tell you, from a security standpoint, the world knows this. So if somebody is trying to get into a system, they're gonna try the workgroup called workgroup, because not many people change that. And you should change that. Managing a workgroup model does get difficult when you have more than 10 systems, because every system is sharing their own resources. So if you have 10 people working at 10 different systems and they have to change around, you have to make 10 accounts at each of them in order to give access to everybody. That's where things get nuts. Workgroups are fine, I would say, with 5 computers, no more. The domain model has one system that watches over all of them. So it implements, for example, users. You create a user on the domain controller, and that user gets propagated out to all the other users. When you make a change in the policies, that will get disseminated to all the other systems, so you don't have to touch each and every single one. This is a good system to centralize management of all your Windows boxes. Same when you share resources like printers and file sharing and all that. They use Active Directory, a system that's been around since Windows NT, still used by Microsoft, even on on Azure. So you can join devices now to a cloud Azure Active Directory, so you're not maintaining everything locally. You can also add your mobile devices to it in order to control all of them in one place up on the cloud. Again, peer-to-peer networking can be done with a small number of machines, but once you get too big, then it just becomes hard to maintain and control. And it's better to go with a domain at that point. Any questions about this chapter? Okie dokie.